So much. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. And I have been for many years a very big fan of the work of communities and schools. So it was great to hear about their impact on your communities. We are in a moment right now where we are still immersed in the impact of COVID-19, an economic crisis, in parts of our country, devastating wildfires and protests against racialized violence. And now schools in their first few months of reopening, where no one feels truly safe. The risks of COVID are still very much present, and educators today are rightfully worried about when they will feel safe in their schools and classrooms again. But Black and brown children and their mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers perhaps feel more threatened than anyone. Trust, which was already pretty fragile, is broken in many places. And so when children ask themselves, am I safe running down my street? Am I safe at school? There is an enormous challenge. How can you teach and learn if your brain keeps thinking, watch out, watch out? And knowing this makes me think about how each of us, every adult in every learning setting, has to know how to support ourselves, our young people, and each other during this period of incredible uncertainty. Before COVID-19 and the events of the past year, if I had had the opportunity to talk to you about human development, the development of the brain, and learning science, I would have begun with this. Each of us has 20,000 genes in our human genome, yet in our lifetime, fewer than 10% of these genes will ever be expressed. What do you think determines what is in that 10%? It is context, the environments, experiences, and relationships in our lives. It's the context that we're exposed to that is the primary driver of who we become, including the expression of our genes. These processes are part of the science of epigenetics. Epi means above, the things which are above the genes that influence what our genes actually do. The risks and opportunities in development and evolution sit inside this one profoundly important point, that there is no separation between nature and nurture, biology and environment, brain and behavior, only a collaboration between them. And this means our lives are not predetermined by a genetic program. Genes are chemical followers. They're little packages of proteins covered with receptors that are triggered into expression by the environment's experiences and relationships in our lives. And epigenetic adaptation is about the biologic processes through which relationships and experiences get under the skin and influence our lifelong learning and health. So if nurture drives nature, there is both good news and bad in that. It means that our brains are a living structure made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. Turnaround for Children was founded in the aftermath of 9/11, and at the time, I was a practicing child psychiatrist in New York specializing in trauma. Turnaround was founded on the core insight that adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. So I want to tell you about what we learned after 9/11, and then I'll turn to how this applies and doesn't apply to what we are all experiencing right now in this time of racial trauma, political unrest, layered onto the COVID-19 pandemic. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I was asked to help lead a study to assess the response to 9/11 in New York City's public school kids. And the finding that surprised all of us at the time was that the most startling effects were not in the ground zero schools. They were in the children in communities of deepest poverty. I'll never forget walking into a first grade class in the South Bronx where the teacher was trying to help her kids digest 9/11, and she had asked them to do a drawing. And a little boy named Thomas, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, came up to me with his drawing. And in it, there were these little boxes in the far corner with smoke coming out. And in the foreground, there were 2 stick figure drawings of boys with guns pointed at each other. Thomas's drawing carried a message. It said, "I'm scared of the violence I see every day when I come to school, and 9/11 is very far away." It was the immediate local context of this child's life that was producing fear and stress and activating the biologic mechanisms we'll be talking about. And not surprisingly, these symptoms were most intense where the system had been activated before because of prior trauma. Today, the stress and trauma children are witnessing and feeling is all around us, in our city streets, in our homes, on TV, and on social media 24/7. And this is playing out in all of our communities in unique and complicated ways. But many children today feel like Thomas, especially if they are Black or brown children. Unlike 9/11, the pandemic is happening to all of us. And I am very aware that it has hit vulnerable communities the hardest, with much higher rates of serious illness and death. And you could say that there's actually a pandemic inside the pandemic, where the combined effects of COVID, economic hardship, racial injustice, have dramatically escalated the inequities and magnified the uncertainties about what is ahead. That 1 in 3 parents of infants and toddlers are skipping or reducing meals, that 1 in 8 children in the US are hungry, that when schools went online in the spring, nearly 17 million kids did not have access to broadband, and that this summer still 30% of Black households with 1 or more child still don't have access to high-speed internet. And that all of this is concentrated in low-income communities are powerful indicators of the injustices of today and the risks to health and academic growth that they carry. And in addition to all of this, there is a unique paradox in this time of COVID, and that is that to keep ourselves physically safe, we need to be physically distant, and this has disrupted the crucial connections to teachers and friends and communities of faith and even family members, the very connections we need to feel safe, to manage stress and fear, and to build our resilience. And the crisis of trust that people, particularly young people of color, are witnessing and experiencing right now, where those who should protect them don't, won't, or can't. Today, trust is very fragile, and in many places, it's broken. So when trust and safety are broken, our bodies and minds are seized by stress. So now we have to talk about the biology of stress and what it does to us, and in particular, what it does to the structures of the limbic system, which is the learning and emotion center of the brain. We know that stress is the most common, naturally occurring example of negative context, that when we experience stress, cortisol is released through our brains and our bodies, and it produces that familiar feeling of fight, flight, and freeze. It's intense when it happens, but if the stress is mild or tolerable, it's actually adaptive. It makes us alert and sharp, and it helps us prepare, like for a test or a performance. This is our limbic system at work: attention, concentration, focus, memory, preparation. But when children have persistently high levels of stress, and that stress is not buffered by the presence of a trusted and calm adult, something else can happen. Children can get locked in that fight or flight feeling where it just won't let up. This is the condition known as toxic stress. So cortisol can do a lot of harm to the structures of the limbic system because, as we said, adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. There's a big upside when we turn to another hormone, the hormone oxytocin. This is the hormonal system that produces feelings of trust, love, attachment, and safety. And that's not all. Oxytocin hits the same structures in the brain as cortisol, yet oxytocin is the more powerful because it can literally protect children at the level of the cell from the damaging effects of cortisol. So relationships like Ray Saldana talked about, that are strong and positive, cause the release of oxytocin. And this not only helps children manage stress, it offsets the damaging effects of cortisol and even produces resilience to future stress. In fact, the human relationship and the hormone oxytocin are the most powerful example we have of positive context. So there are really only 3 things that I want you to remember about brain development: astounding malleability, the experience-dependent growth, and the role of context. And because of this, there's no such thing as a developing child independent of context. And it is this single point that carries the enormous opportunity that we have, because we are all brain builders. We are. We can be brain builders because we can build environments in our classrooms and schools and even our homes that help our children cope with stress, build resilience, and develop the interests and passions and mindsets and skills to flourish in this world. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So I wonder how many of you are familiar with the Marshmallow Test. I suspect many of you. It was a test conducted back in the 70s at a nursery school in Stanford University. The children were put in a room with a marshmallow and presented with a choice: eat the marshmallow right away or wait 15 minutes and get a second marshmallow. Now, the research findings on the children who could delay gratification and exert self-control for that length of time were correlated with success in school, higher SAT scores, college acceptance, and even later success in life. But now, fast forward to 2012. Dr. Celeste Kidd, a researcher then at the University of Rochester who had worked in a homeless shelter, asked herself the question: would any of the kids in my shelter have ever waited to get a second marshmallow? This researcher repeated the marshmallow test under the following conditions. First, she put children in a room with broken crayons, and she promised to come back with brand new ones. And in half the cases, that's what she did, and the children got a new set of crayons. But with the other half, she came back and she said, sorry, I don't have any new crayons after all. And then she repeated the marshmallow test. And what do you think happened? The kids who got the new crayons, where the promise was kept, waited and waited and waited for that second marshmallow, no problem. But the kids where the promise was broken gobbled up that first marshmallow right away. So the ability to delay gratification, it turns out, has a lot to do with whether you trust the person giving you the marshmallow. But here's the most important thing that Dr. Kidd did. Dr. Kidd challenged the assumptions in the original test, and she made the leap to understanding that this skill of self-control that is so important to learning is not just in the child. It is in the child in a context that was designed to reveal the skill. In this case, through the experience of a trustful relationship. This researcher altered the microenvironment around these children. And by doing that, she was able to reveal the skill, the malleable skill of self-control that these kids actually had. She did this by establishing trust with them. Now think about what this story means about the environments we could create to reveal the potential skills and talents that exist in all young people. And think about the talents that we as adults don't see and won't see unless we design environments to reveal them. So how do we do that? So this reminds me of something I wanted to share with you, because when I first read what Dr. Kidd did, it lined up with everything I believed about children, everything I knew when I was working one-on-one with children as a doctor, seeing children who had known unbelievable kinds of trauma. I knew severe trauma as a child, and it's what caused me to become a doctor. So nothing could shake my belief in a child's capacity to recover and grow, and that we must never, ever underestimate what a child is capable of. So I left my practice and I founded Turnaround with this belief that has not been shaken since. But there was a point in my practice where something changed the way that I worked. In addition to seeing kids in my office, I went to visit their homes and their schools, and I spent time with their families. I learned about the context of my kids' lives, and that taught me something else, that sometimes forces are stacked up, hurdles are too high, and that we all have a responsibility for the height of those hurdles. It's not only having high expectations and a belief in our kids, it is also about the height of the hurdles they face, the racist barriers that are real and high, particularly for Black and Brown children. And those of us who erected the hurdles and benefited from them bear the greatest responsibility to change them. That means we have to stop and pay attention to what they are and how they get expressed as stereotype, as implicit bias, as racism, and what these beliefs and attitudes project about the worth and potential of Black and Brown children. There are systems and harmful practices like shaming, exclusion, tracking that are going on right now, and we have to end them. We need to replace them with environments designed to reveal who young people are, their talents and their skills, just like Dr. Kidd did. Because children are wired to develop, they are. They have all the equipment to flourish and succeed and thrive. And our job, my job as a doctor, was to nurture them, to lower the hurdles, and to clear the boulders out of the way. Our job as educators is to do the same, to create the environments in our schools and classrooms that reveal who students are so they know their worth, discover their interests and passions, and develop their skills, their competencies, and their identities. We can do this with the knowledge we have today from developmental and learning science because the science is clear. It calls for us to design schools mapped to the way the brain learns, a design that combines 5 elements: positive relationships, environments filled with safety and belonging, integrated supports, the intentional development of the skills, mindsets, and habits that all successful learners have, and rich, meaningful instructional experiences where students discover what they're capable of. Because the development of a whole child emerges when we combine these 5 elements into experiences that connect to one another. And if you want to picture this, picture a web of experiences, because this is how our brains actually develop. Lots of connections that happen between brain structures, and it is these connections that produce increasingly complex skills. A great example of this is how we learn to read. First, we're read to. We learn to recognize letters and how letters form words and sounds and create images and feelings. Plus, we like the feeling of being read to. But each part of learning how to read involves different brain structures getting wired together through the experience of learning to read, and eventually, we become able to do this complex thing called reading. This is how our brains become integrated and wired to produce any complex skill. So take a look at this PET scan. This is a PET scan of a brain actually reading, and look at the structures that light up. You have sight, hearing, expression, comprehension. Experiences that grow our brains can happen everywhere, in schools, communities, ball fields, everywhere that children grow and learn. And today, in the time of this COVID pandemic, this means our homes as well as our classrooms. Settings designed with this knowledge of how children learn, that can recognize the effects of bias and stereotype and break down racist structures. Settings like this can be like an ecological vaccine that is rich in protective factors, ignites the developing brain, promotes wellness, and protects children from the damaging effects of stress, all at the same time. But the wheel is a circle. So where does a circle start? For human development and learning, it matters what you do first, second, and third. Relationships are first, because relationships are the fuel for brain development and for managing stress. And as we said, relationships that are strong and positive not only help children manage stress, they can also offset the damaging effects of cortisol and produce resilience to future stress. So when we speak about the human relationship, we're not just talking about being nice to a child. We're speaking about a connection that is built through consistent caring, protection, presence, and trust, one that can make a child believe something that they just couldn't believe about themselves until you entered their lives. Then we have safety and belonging. In virtually every study of positive youth development, there's always one finding that is right at the top, and that is that children will struggle to engage and learn where they don't feel physically, emotionally, and identity safe, when they don't feel like they and their culture are represented and valued in the learning community. And for integrated supports, we're talking about building comprehensive and integrated tiered supports, like a multi-tiered system of supports that can tip the balance toward an environment that is rich in protective factors, one where students feel safe, motivated, and engaged. And for us, this means a robust tier one, an environment where students feel they can take risks in the name of learning, where they feel a culture of belief, high expectations, warm demand, and support, where relationships are positive, student, teacher, peer, discipline is fair and not about shame and blame, and is built with restorative practices. Then we have complex skill and mindset development. And this is a framework for skill development called the Building Blocks for Learning. Some of you might be familiar with this. It was developed by Brooke Stafford Brizard when she was a turnaround, and it lays out the skills that are essential for learning. One of the things we realized when we built this framework is that there are multiple pathways through which children can acquire those higher order learning skills, like self-direction, perseverance, resilience, if we intentionally build them. Now, I'm going to go into more detail on this in a bit, but I want to speak about our fifth non-negotiable, rich instructional experiences. These are the kinds of experiences that fully engage and challenge us, where we discover what we're capable of. Think for a minute about who and what were part of that experience for you. How did you discover what you're capable of? And if you're willing, share it in the chat. But somebody who actually studied this was a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who in the 1930s wrote about this when he described the proximal zone of development. This is a zone of development just beyond what we think we can do. But then we discover we can do it because there was an adult who saw it first, provided just a little bit of the right kind of support or belief, and then we could do it ourselves. The distance between what we believe we can do and what we can do with support, this is called our developmental range. And every single human skill has a developmental range of performance. And so when we speak of this thing called student potential, it's real because we're literally speaking of operationalizing a student's developmental range by making that range visible to the student and the adult. Vygotsky believed that this was what was at the heart of all great teaching. So how do we do that? How does any child become an engaged, productive learner? And how do they build these increasingly complex skills, whether it's a thorny algebra word problem or writing a beautiful composition? When we built this framework, we were asking ourselves a question. How does any child become an engaged learner? Could there be different pathways to developing these skills and mindsets like there are for reading and math? Because if such pathways existed and we knew what they were, we could design classrooms to develop these skills in all kids. Every skill in this framework is malleable, which means it can be built. And each skill is highly correlated with achievement and life success. And you can see a developmental progression beginning with those foundational skills at the bottom, things like self-regulation, executive function, relationships and social skills. Then the critical mindsets for school like belonging and growth mindset, and then the higher order skills that we want all children to have, like perseverance and self-direction. So in practice, this framework shows us that we could develop these powerful skills for learning from any starting point. And there's more, because when you look at those bottom two rows, those are the skills that are supposed to be well established when a child enters kindergarten so that they're ready for school. Yet we know that many children have uneven development of these skills because of the effects of stress that we've been talking about, especially now. So when we think about this pandemic and the many forms of traumatic experiences that young people are having right now, and you ask yourself, what will the effects on learning be? Well, this is where you will see it in children's ability to focus and concentrate, their working memory, how they regulate their emotions and their behavior, whether they are at home and for sure as they return to school. And the headline here is that if we don't intentionally build and strengthen these foundational skills and mindsets, not only are children at risk of being unprepared for learning as early as kindergarten, they're at risk to fall behind or to not develop these essential higher order 21st century skills and mastery level competencies that they will need for learning, work, and life. So when we developed this framework, we had one purpose in mind: to show that there are these multiple pathways from any starting point, even if that starting point included the experience of trauma. Now, you may all know this, but the word trauma is a stigma to children who have it. No one who has it wants to be known as having it. No one wants to be taught by somebody where they feel labeled right from the start. It sets up a relationship that is deficit oriented. What we all need to know is that trauma causes a disruption in our lives, a disruption to health, mood, behavior, skill development, and learning. And it can happen to any of us. But what our kids want to know is that it can be fixed without stigma and shame. And it can be. So this is the usual point in my presentations where a leader or a teacher might be thinking, so how do I do all of this on top of everything I'm already being asked to do? And the answer is that everything I'm speaking about are practices and supports for building these skills that can easily be combined with the teaching of content. I want to show you one video from the series, the Edutopia series that we talked about earlier, a video that illustrates this very point. This is a teacher in a middle school in Portland, Maine, who is partnering with one of her students to teach executive function skills to her entire class. And as you watch the video, take note of how many of the practices that we've been talking about are visible in this classroom, this very low tech classroom.
Okay, so which one of those things is probably going to be your frog? Mark Twain said, if you wake up every morning and eat a frog, everything else will taste great. So I taught them to take their frog from the list, which is the thing they want to do the least, and get it out of the way, because everything else will seem easy.
A frog is like the most important assignment, like the one I'm really worried about.
Dry ice. So, okay, you gotta do that. What's your frog?
It helps me like realize I need to get this done faster than I need to get this done. So even though this is more fun, I need to get this out of the way before I can do this.
So as soon as we're done with that priority list, I notice everyone gets right to work because they have it spelled out very clearly for them.
This video is from a series we did in collaboration with Edutopia. I think it was mentioned in the introduction of me. Edutopia is George Lucas's organization, and what we wanted to do was demonstrate the fact that these whole child practices are going on in schools across the country right now. And to this point, this video series has had over 12 million views. So when you think about that video, you want to name the practices that were actually evident, the relationship skills, the culture, the strategies for supporting rich instructional experiences, like working on projects as a team, and most of all, developing this crucial skill of executive function. Bringing this kind of skill development to life in a classroom means classrooms designed for relationships and teamwork, adults trained to know how the brain grows and how learning happens, and integrated tools to make it easier for teachers to teach rigorous content and develop the skills of curious, self-directed learners at the very same time. I think every one of you knows that historically, there's been a false choice in education between the things we need to do on social and emotional learning, on physical and mental health, and the pursuit of academic excellence. But not today. Today, we know that a healthy context for learning and development requires attention to young people's safety, their health, their mental health, their social and emotional and cognitive development, their academic skills, and their identities. And not some of these things, all of these things together, because it's all one developmental story. And the non-negotiables for whole child design will cover all of the important bases for you and our young people. The neurobiologic story here is simple. The brain is malleable. As we said, it is the tissue in the human body that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. And a brain under stress is shut down. It can't focus or concentrate. It has little working memory, and it is easily triggered. And the way our brains are wired, it is our emotions that drive our cognitive and learning skills. It is our emotions that engage us or they shut us down. So today, in this time of COVID-19, in this time of extreme inequity, we have no choice. The path to a calm classroom is a calm brain. The path to learning is a calm brain. And the path to a calm brain is to prioritize activities that build relationships, establish routines, and promote resilience, what we are calling the new 3 R's. And all of these are drawn from the non-negotiables for whole child design that we've been talking about. For relationships, we know they are the active ingredient in the learning environment because they are the way trust is built, oxytocin is released, and the limbic system is activated. In fact, trust is the antidote to stress, and relationships are the medium through which we experience trust. One example of a relationship building practice is called banking time. You schedule 10 to 15 minutes with individual students who are struggling 1 to 3 times a week, depending on their need. This becomes sacred time for informal connection and support where a teacher listens and validates feelings and emotions. The student knows you are there, that you care, and this builds trust and confidence, especially with students who are struggling. And what you will see is how it helps them regulate their own emotions and behavior. And then there's looping. which ensures that students can stay connected with a teacher that they feel close to over multiple years. And more than anything, at the start of this unprecedented school year, setting aside time that is dedicated to strengthening existing relationships, building new ones, understanding what children have been learning during the summer. Don't assume only losses. Some young people have been making meals, doing homework with younger siblings, helping their working parents. You can celebrate these very real accomplishments in your advisories. For strong routines, did you know that the brain is a prediction machine that loves order? It loves novelty too, but it is calm when things are orderly and it knows what's coming next. It gets anxious when things are not predictable. So our task is to build consistent routines in our schools, our classrooms, and our homes. And this can be done by having students create their own daily planner in school or at home, where they set achievable goals for different things, whether they are learning activities, exercise, or fun, and celebrate successes along the way. And finally, for resilience, building resilience just might be the most important task we have right now. You might think that resilience is something you either have or you don't, like eye color. But resilience is actually more like a muscle that can be built. And the key to building resilience is recognizing first that we all have strengths to build upon. And the key to growing those strengths, growing resilience, is building our regulation skills, physical, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, through co-regulation. That means modeling and coaching, which will help children develop their own skills by understanding their feelings and their emotions, and then managing their own behavior. One way to do this is through a tiered support system. We spoke about that, where each tier is fully fleshed out. You have strong relationships, developing skills and mindsets like belonging, and even using meditation and movement. In tier 2, it's targeted supports in the classroom for students that are struggling. And in tier 3, it's making sure that all students know where they can go, to whom they can go for help, especially mental health help. But here's the secret sauce in all of this. We said that the brain is a dynamic living structure. It's also an electrical structure. And the fuel for brain development, you guessed it, it comes from relationships. The brain becomes more and more wired, with connections forming between brain structures as we produce increasingly complex skills. And it happens because our brains are stimulated by relationships and rich learning experiences, whether it's learning to read, doing a math problem, or developing resilience. And let's remember this, that in any book we have ever read about anyone who has surmounted adversity and gone on to do amazing things, there is always one consistent ingredient that made it happen. It was a person who never gave up on them, had their back, expressed belief, loaned some courage at a particular point, but it wasn't an accident. This is the power each of us carries, to be that person for a young person and for each other right now at home or at school. So what if we did use 21st century science to transform our education systems? Well, in 2017, Turnaround helped found the Science of Learning and Development Alliance. A bunch of scientists and practitioners came together to answer a question. How do we use 21st century science to transform 21st century learning? And if we did, what science should we pay attention to? Well, the big aha was realizing that our 20th century system was never designed to develop the whole child. It was designed to deliver content, to test for the content and use the testing to sort and select who gets to go on to good colleges and good jobs. It was never designed to develop the learner. It was never designed for equity. and it was never designed to unleash student potential. The year is 2020 today, but do you know that exactly 100 years ago, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin? At the time, people believed that something called miasma caused disease. But his discovery was based on a new theory, the germ theory, that germs cause disease. So you could think that everyone celebrated this, but they didn't. They resisted it because it challenged all of their assumptions about what causes disease. But then something big happened. World War II, and millions of lives were saved by penicillin. And you had this huge database that supported the new theory and the new solution that this drug represented. This event changed the field of medicine forever. Well, I believe we could be in one of those inflection points right now. Yet in 2020, we have to say resistance to scientific knowledge is alive and well. We see it every day after over 220,000 COVID deaths and over 8 million cases in this country. But COVID-19 and the national reckoning we're experiencing on racial inequality have done something else. They have laid bare the inequities in the systems we have, including our education systems. But today, our penicillin, were we to use it, is to take what we already know from the science of learning and development and use it to define a new purpose for education, one dedicated to developing every learner with 21st century skills and mastery level competencies, using the principles that we've been talking about of whole child design in all of the settings in which children grow and learn, including our homes, our schools, and our communities. The standardized approaches we've taken thus far to learning and schools have not fully challenged our assumptions about talent. Is it plentiful or is it scarce? Or individual growth? Are skills malleable or are they fixed? Or human potential? What is any child capable of under the right conditions? The message in the science is so optimistic. Genes are chemical followers. This is the biologic truth that context and relationship shape the expression of our genetic potential. And we can ask and answer the same question that researchers in other fields have asked, the same question that Dr. Celeste Kidd asked with the Marshmallow Test. What can we do that will work optimally for this child in this context? And it is that question that gets you to fundamentally different answers about the way our schools and our education system of the future needs to be designed. One that puts relationships at the center of learning, one that is designed to see and unleash the potential in each and every child. Thank you all so much for letting me join you today.